Before we dive into today's story, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales. James Walker, a retired accountant in his late 50s, stood at his front window, sipping coffee as he watched the quiet street outside. His house, nestled in a suburban neighborhood, was the picture of order and control. Everything was meticulously arranged, from the trim hedges lining his driveway to the gleaming surfaces of his immaculate home. The neighborhood had just begun to wake up. A jogger passed, waving cheerfully toward James's house. He didn't wave back, merely grunting into his cup. "Another day?" he muttered, his voice rusty from lack of use. James's life was a pattern of routine and solitude. Each morning he followed the same schedule. By 8 a.m., he was seated at his desk, scrolling through financial news on his tablet. Even in retirement, his life revolved around numbers and investments, a habit he couldn't shake. His house was devoid of warmth or personal touches. The silence within those walls was a reflection of James's life, ordered, predictable, and lonely. That evening, as he sat alone at his dining table, the sound of children playing drifted in through an open window. Annoyed, James rose and slammed the window shut, muttering, "Can't even enjoy peace and quiet in my own home." He returned to his meal, the tick of the clock in the hallway his only companion. James rarely interacted with his neighbors. He ignored invitations, avoided small talk, and dismissed any attempt at connection. To him, solitude was a shield, something that kept his life under control. One morning, James's routine was disrupted. A moving truck rumbled down the street and parked in front of the vacant house across from his. Curiosity pulled him to the window. He watched as a lively family began unloading their belongings. The Parkers, a black family of 5, were a stark contrast to James's quiet existence. Stephen, the father, directed movers with a wide smile. Angela, his wife, unpacked boxes while their 3 children ran about laughing and chasing each other. James's frown deepened as the noise filled the street. "Wonderful," he muttered sarcastically. "There goes the neighborhood." Later that day, while trimming his hedges, James noticed Stephen and Angela approaching. "Hello there," Stephen greeted warmly. "I'm Stephen Parker, and this is my wife Angela. We just moved in across the street." James straightened, his face an emotionless mask. "James Walker," he said curtly. Angela extended her hand, undeterred. "We wanted to say hello and introduce ourselves." James looked at her hand but didn't take it. "If you'll excuse me, I'm busy," he said, turning back to his work. Stephen chuckled nervously. "We're having a barbecue this weekend to meet the neighbors. We'd love for you to join us." "Not interested," James replied without looking up. Angela's smile faltered, but she said kindly, "Well, the invitation stands. It was nice to meet you." James watched them leave out of the corner of his eye. He dismissed the faint twinge of guilt he felt. "Better off alone," he muttered to himself. A few days later, Angela returned, holding a freshly baked pie. She rang James's doorbell and waited patiently. James opened the door, his face hardening when he saw her. "What is it?" "I made an apple pie," Angela said cheerfully. "I thought you might enjoy some." James hesitated, his stern expression softening for a brief moment. "That's not necessary," he muttered, though he reached for the pie. "It's no trouble," Angela said with a smile. James grumbled a quick, "Thank you," before shutting the door. Angela stood on the porch for a moment, her smile fading as she turned to leave. Inside, James set the pie on his counter and stared at it. Her gesture, so simple yet kind, unsettled him. Across the street, Angela rejoined her family. Stephen looked up from playing catch with their youngest son. "How'd it go?" Angela sighed. He took the pie but didn't seem interested in talking. Their daughter, Grace, frowned. "Why doesn't Mr. Walker like us?" Angela knelt beside her. "Sometimes people need time to open up, sweetie. We just have to keep being kind." That kindness was put to the test one stormy night. Thunder rumbled, and rain pounded against windows as the neighborhood lost power. Inside the Parker home, their youngest son, Liam, lay feverish on the couch. "His fever's getting worse," Angela said, her voice trembling. "We need to get him to a hospital." Stephen looked outside, worry etched on his face. "The car won't start, and the roads are flooded." A flash of lightning illuminated James's house across the street. "He has a generator," Angela said. Stephen hesitated but nodded. "It's our only chance." The couple bundled Liam in a blanket and braved the storm, knocking urgently on James's door. When James opened it, his eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "Our son is very sick," Angela pleaded. "We need help to get to the hospital." James's gaze flicked to Liam, then back to the Parkers. "I can't help you," he said, his voice cold. Angela's face fell. "Please, we're desperate." "I'm sorry," James said, retreating inside. The door clicked shut, leaving the Parkers standing in the rain, stunned and heartbroken. They stumbled back toward their house, but salvation came from another neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, who happened to be returning home. She rushed them to the hospital, where doctors treated Liam for a severe infection. This story is just beginning, but due to its length, I'll continue in the next message. Stay tuned. James woke up the next morning to find the storm had passed, leaving behind broken tree limbs and flooded yards. He noticed the Parker home was eerily quiet. His thoughts drifted to the frantic knock on his door, the look of desperation on Angela's face, and the sick child bundled in her arms. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the memory. "Not my responsibility," he muttered, retreating into his routine. But the guilt lingered, a constant hum at the back of his mind. As days turned into weeks, James couldn't ignore the changes in the neighborhood. The Parkers were still friendly, but seemed more reserved when they saw him. Where Stephen used to call out a cheerful, "Good morning," now he simply waved politely. Angela no longer brought baked goods or stopped to chat. The children avoided his yard entirely. For a man who claimed to value solitude, James felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it regret? Loneliness? One crisp morning, James felt unusually weak as he got out of bed. A strange pressure built in his chest and his left arm tingled. He brushed it off as a bad night's sleep. But by noon, the pressure had turned into pain, sharp and unrelenting. He stumbled into the kitchen, reaching for his phone, but the pain was too much. He collapsed, clutching his chest as darkness consumed him. The sound of James's open door creaking in the wind caught Angela's attention as she returned from the store. Concerned, she called Stephen and they approached cautiously. "Mr. Walker, are you okay?" Angela called out. Hearing no response, Stephen stepped inside. They found James lying on the floor, pale and unresponsive. "Call 911, Stephen shouted as Angela knelt beside James, checking for a pulse. When James awoke in the hospital, a doctor explained he had suffered a heart attack. "You're lucky your neighbors found you," the doctor said. "Their quick actions saved your life." James stared at the ceiling, overwhelmed. The Parkers had saved him, after everything. He felt a lump rise in his throat, his mind replaying all the moments he had shut them out. Later that day, Angela and Stephen visited him. Angela carried a small bouquet of flowers. "How are you feeling, Mr. Walker?" she asked softly. James struggled to meet her gaze. "Why did you help me?" Angela smiled gently. "Because it was the right thing to do." Tears welled up in James's eyes. "I'm so sorry. For everything. I've been such a fool." Angela placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's never too late to change, Mr. Walker." Returning home, James felt a shift inside himself. He realized how hollow his life had been, how much he had missed out on by keeping others at arm's length. Determined to make amends, he baked a batch of cookies, a bit burnt, but it was the thought that counted, and brought them to the Parker house. Angela accepted them with a warm smile, inviting him in. Over tea, James apologized sincerely. The Parkers, true to their compassionate nature, forgave him without hesitation. In the months that followed, James became a fixture in the Parker household. He helped Liam with his homework, taught Grace how to garden, and shared stories with the whole family over Sunday dinners. Slowly but surely, James transformed from the grumpy recluse into a cherished friend and neighbor. At the annual block party, James surprised everyone by volunteering to run the grill. He mingled with neighbors, cracking jokes and sharing laughs. "Who would have thought?" Mrs. Johnson remarked. "James Walker, the life of the party." James smiled, savoring the warmth of community he had once rejected. One evening, as James sat on the Parkers' porch, watching the sunset with the family that had changed his life, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. Angela looked at him, her eyes kind. "For what?" "For showing me what it means to be part of something bigger than myself," James replied. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, James felt at peace. He was no longer the man who lived in isolation, but someone surrounded by love, kindness, and a sense of belonging. As the weeks turned into months, James embraced his newfound role within the community. He had come a long way from the man who once slammed his door in the faces of his neighbors. Now, his days were filled with purpose and connection. He joined the local neighborhood association, surprising everyone with his enthusiasm for community projects. When the town park needed volunteers to plant flowers and repair benches, James was one of the first to sign up. With his knack for organization, he helped secure donations from local businesses, ensuring the park's transformation into a vibrant gathering place for families. One Saturday morning, James noticed Grace sitting on her front porch, her face scrunched in frustration as she worked through her math homework. James couldn't resist. "Need some help?" he asked, leaning over the fence. Grace's face lit up. "Would you? I'm so stuck." Before long, James was seated at the Parkers' kitchen table, patiently explaining algebra to Grace. The bond between them grew quickly. She even joked about how much easier math would have been if she'd had him as a teacher sooner. Meanwhile, little Liam became James's shadow. The two often spent afternoons tinkering in James's garage, building birdhouses and model airplanes. Liam's laughter echoed through the neighborhood, a sound that warmed James's heart. "You've got a knack for this, kid," James would say, ruffling Liam's hair. "And you're the best teacher ever, Mr. Walker," Liam would reply with a grin. The transformation in James's life didn't stop there. One evening, as the Parkers and James sat together on the porch, Angela mentioned the local food bank was short on supplies. "I'll help," James said without hesitation. Within days, James had mobilized the neighborhood. Flyers went up, social media posts were shared, and donations poured in. On the day of the drive, James stood proudly in the community center as families arrived with bags of groceries. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," a volunteer said. "This wouldn't have been possible without you." James felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the people who had come together to make a difference. The holiday season brought even more joy. For Christmas, James joined the Parkers in decorating their home. The children insisted he hang the star on the tree, a gesture that left him misty-eyed. "This is the first Christmas I've looked forward to in years," he admitted. "You're part of the family now," Stephen said warmly, clapping James on the shoulder. As the year drew to a close, James reflected on how much his life had changed. The once isolated man who avoided everyone now thrived in the heart of the community. He had discovered the power of connection, the joy of giving, and the warmth of love. One evening, as he sat in his newly flourishing garden, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, James smiled. "I never thought life could feel this full," he said to Angela. "It's because you opened your heart," she replied. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, James knew he had finally found what he had been missing all along, a life worth living. As the year drew to a close, James found himself marveling at how drastically his life had transformed. The man who once lived behind closed doors, who had scoffed at invitations and avoided even the smallest gestures of friendliness, now thrived at the very heart of the community he had spent years ignoring. His days were filled with new experiences and connections that brought meaning to his life. Whether it was lending a hand at a community event or simply sharing a cup of tea with Angela on the porch, each moment felt like a gift. James had discovered the power of connection, the simple joy of giving, and the indescribable warmth of being surrounded by people who genuinely cared for him. One evening, after a particularly lively neighborhood game night hosted at the Parker home, James found himself back in his garden. He had worked tirelessly over the past months to turn the once sterile patch of grass into a lush oasis. Vibrant flowers now lined the edges, and a small vegetable patch thrived in the center. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the space, casting a gentle glow as they swayed in the evening breeze. James sat on a wooden bench he had built himself, gazing at the sky as it transitioned into twilight. The garden was alive with the soft chirps of crickets and the distant laughter of children playing a final round of hide-and-seek before bed. The sound of footsteps brought James out of his reverie. He turned to see Angela approaching with 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea. "I thought you could use some company," she said, handing him one of the mugs. James smiled, gesturing for her to sit beside him. "You always seem to know what I need, Angela," he said warmly. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. James glanced around the garden, taking in the small details he had come to cherish: the vines climbing the trellis, the delicate roses blooming by the fence, and the small bird feeder that Liam had painted bright red and blue. "I never thought life could feel this full," James finally said, his voice tinged with awe. Angela smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "It's because you opened your heart," she replied gently. James nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "I spent so many years convinced that shutting people out was the only way to protect myself. I thought independence meant never needing anyone, but I see now how wrong I was." Angela placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You've come a long way, James, and in the process, you've made this neighborhood a better place for all of us. You didn't just open your heart, you taught others to do the same." James felt a lump in his throat. He thought about the food drives, the park restoration project, and the countless moments of connection he had shared with his neighbors. He realized that his transformation had created ripples far beyond his own life. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you and your family enough," James said, his voice cracking slightly. Angela shook her head with a smile. "You already have. Every time you share your time, your kindness, or even just a smile with someone in this neighborhood, you're paying it forward." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, James felt a profound sense of peace. He thought about all the people who had entered his life over the past year and how much richer his days had become because of them. "I've spent so much time trying to find purpose," James said, his voice quiet but steady. "And it was right here all along, in the people around me." Angela nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes the hardest thing is to let people in. But once you do, the rewards are endless." The two sat together as the stars began to dot the sky, their presence a quiet testament to the bonds they had forged. James felt a newfound resolve growing within him. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. He thought about the upcoming year and all the ways he could continue to contribute to the community. Perhaps he would mentor at the local youth center or start a gardening club to share his passion with others. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in his life, James wasn't daunted by them. He was excited. Angela's voice broke through his thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her tone curious. James chuckled softly. "About what's next," he said. "About how much more I can do, how many more lives I can touch. I've wasted so much time being closed off, and now I want to make every moment count." Angela smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You already are, James. You already are." As they finished their tea, James felt a warmth settle in his chest. His life had become something he once thought impossible. A life filled with meaning, connection, and an unshakable sense of belonging. And as he gazed up at the stars that night, James made a silent vow to himself to keep growing, keep giving, and keep cherishing every single moment of his newfound life. As the night deepened, James remained on the bench, watching the stars scatter like diamonds across the vast sky. The world around him grew quieter, the hum of neighborhood life fading into the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Angela had said her goodbyes, leaving James alone with his thoughts and the glow of his flourishing garden. His mind wandered back to the people he had reconnected with over the past year. He thought of his old college friend Tom, whose forgiveness and warm laughter had rekindled a friendship James had believed was long lost. He recalled the phone call with his estranged sister, the tentative start of healing after years of silence. These moments felt like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place, creating a picture of a life James never thought he'd have. The next morning, James awoke with a sense of purpose. After a quick breakfast, he walked across the street to the Parkers' house, holding a small notebook. Angela opened the door and greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, James. What brings you by so early?" James held up the notebook. "I've been thinking about ways we can do even more for the neighborhood. Mind if I share some ideas?" Angela stepped aside, ushering him in. "Of course. Let's hear them." They sat at the kitchen table as James flipped through the pages, detailing his plans. He suggested starting a community garden where neighbors could grow fresh vegetables and flowers together. He talked about organizing monthly potlucks to foster connections between families. He even proposed creating a mentorship program to pair older residents with younger ones, passing on skills and wisdom. Angela listened intently, nodding with enthusiasm. "These are incredible ideas, James. I think you're onto something big here." "You really think so?" James asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I know so," Angela replied firmly. "You have a gift for bringing people together. Let's make this happen." Over the following weeks, James threw himself into the projects with the same determination he had once reserved for his career. He visited every house on the block, speaking to neighbors about his ideas and inviting them to join. To his delight, nearly everyone was eager to participate. The community garden was the first project to take shape. James donated a portion of his backyard, and with the help of volunteers, they transformed the space into a lush haven. Raised beds sprouted with tomatoes, lettuce, and peppers, while trellises supported climbing beans and cucumbers. Children painted colorful signs to mark each family's section, and every weekend, neighbors gathered to tend the garden together. During one such gathering, James noticed a young boy struggling to pull weeds. He knelt beside the child, showing him how to grip the roots firmly and tug with steady pressure. The boy beamed at his success, and James felt a familiar warmth in his chest. "This garden isn't just about plants," Angela said, watching the scene unfold. "It's about planting seeds of connection." James smiled. "And watching them grow," he added. The potlucks became a monthly tradition that everyone looked forward to. Long tables lined with dishes brought by neighbors filled the park, the air rich with the aromas of homemade casseroles, pies, and barbecue. James always arrived early to help set up, greeting each family with a smile as they arrived. At one potluck, a shy new family hesitated at the edge of the gathering. James noticed them and walked over, introducing himself warmly. By the end of the evening, they were chatting easily with other neighbors, their initial hesitance replaced by laughter and smiles. The mentorship program was James's most ambitious idea, and it quickly became his favorite. He paired retirees with younger residents based on shared interests, creating opportunities for skills to be passed down. He taught a group of teenagers basic budgeting and finance, watching their confidence grow with each session. One afternoon, a young woman approached James after a workshop. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," she said. "I never thought I'd understand this stuff, but you made it so clear." James felt a swell of pride. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said. "You're going to do great things." As the months passed, the changes in the neighborhood were undeniable. Strangers had become friends, and a true sense of community blossomed. James often marveled at how far they had all come, himself most of all. One evening, After a particularly successful potluck, the Parkers invited James to stay for a late-night cup of coffee. As they sat around the living room, the children playing a board game on the floor, Angela turned to James with a smile. "You know, James," she said, "none of this would have happened without you." James shook his head. "It wasn't just me. Everyone contributed. I just got the ball rolling." Stephen leaned forward, his expression serious but warm. "Sometimes that's all it takes, a little push in the right direction. You gave us that and we'll always be grateful." Later that night, as James walked home under a canopy of stars, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The man who had once viewed connection as a burden now saw it as life's greatest gift. Reaching his front porch, James paused to look across the street at the Parker house. The lights were still on, a warm glow spilling out onto the lawn. He smiled, knowing that because of them, he had not only rediscovered himself, but had also found a family. As he stepped inside, James glanced at the framed photo of the Parker family on his mantel. He touched it gently, a silent vow forming in his heart. "I'll keep this going," he whispered. "For them. For all of us." And with that, James turned off the lights and went to bed, dreaming of all the ways he would continue to make a difference. If you were moved by James's story of transformation and the kindness of the Parkers, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have shown the same compassion? Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. Your support means the world to me,